and welcome to the Halfie Project podcast. My name is Becky, sitting at the table. Over there is Cedric Sky City, and you're listening to yet another episode with us. And, well, today is going to be a pretty fun topic. They're all pretty fun topics. But I have to say, today is going to be a bit more, like our last two topics were information heavy, right?
Yeah.
This one, we're going to wade a little bit into personal experiences and extrapolations from research that we found and what it's like actually living here, right?
That is correct.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay, I'm not prepared for this, but let's see if I can answer.
This is the question.
Sure.
Are you white?
You know, I've had people say that I am on the inside back in the day.
Oh, okay.
But I have enough self-awareness and physical awareness to know that I'm not.
Physical awareness. I'm sure you have heard of the term white privilege.
Of course.
Yeah. And what does that mean to you?
I think white privilege is a certain type of privilege that is, I don't want to say bestowed upon the white man and white woman, but it is sort of it's something that is just naturally given to you depending on the context and society that you're in. For example, in the States, there is a certain type of privilege that you have being white.
Are you sucking on something?
I am. Yeah, it was a little awkward, right?
Yeah.
Like I realized I didn't finish my mint before we started.
Your jaw is jutting out a little bit.
I'm trying not to be like very noticeable.
But
okay,
it's
let me finish the mint.
Okay,
it's just a mint.
You finish the mint, and then we'll continue this conversation.
I'm sorry, I was trying to be very subtle with that. Okay, so white privilege to me is basically a certain type of privilege that you have, and it's a privilege that allows you to go throughout society with maybe a leg up or just with an advantage in different areas. And it can mean different things in different contexts, but essentially you have a certain privilege that people who are not white, maybe those that are brown, black, or darker skin or from another part of the world that they don't have. And it's something that, to me, it's, yes, there are cases where it's very overt, but I think it's more times than not just built into either the systems or just built into everyday life in people's experiences. And it's something that, again, you can't really define it with one stroke of a brush. It just kind of manifests itself in different ways with different people. But I think there is an overall privilege that that basically white people have in their context or even across the world in different places.
I was about to take it a step farther because I feel like we hear the term white privilege often in Western societies. We hear it a lot in the US right now, especially. But asking more, what about in places where white people aren't naturally part of the system? Was the system built around them? Then what does white privilege look like there? And in particular, we're going to ask that question, white privilege in Korea, does it exist here? And what might that look like? But first, I guess we should, briefly define this white privilege concept.
Right. And this could be a sensitive topic. Obviously, a lot of our topics are sensitive. This one in particular, especially with the cultural climate today. Yeah. In the West and also here in the East, I would say, in some form or another. Yeah. So we just want to say that we're going to tread as cautiously, but also as honestly as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cautiously and honestly.
Right.
Like we're going to tiptoe, but we're going to be naked.
Dive in. Yeah. And I'm saying cautiously in that, not that we're going to, hide the truth or facts as we see it or know it, but we want to just present it in the best way. We want to present it in a way that reflects the reality, basically.
Okay, that's good. That's very good. Yeah. And I feel like still people struggle with white privilege as a term.
Yeah.
I think depending on who you ask, your answer might come back differently. But kind of as, let's just give it an overall definition.
Sure.
I was looking into white privilege. What is white privilege? How do people define white privilege? And well, first off, you have to step backwards and define racism, right?
Yeah.
And I found this article that was describing racial bias and racism and how there's a difference between those two, and then white privilege reflecting off of that. So I'll just read through some of those notes I pulled from it just so we can move on to the next part of the conversation. But basically, this person was saying racial bias is a belief. You're believing something about people who look different from you, okay? Racism is what happens when that belief translates into action.
Right.
And this insinuates that a lot of people have these biases already.
Sure.
But not everybody is acting on them.
Right. Yeah. And I think there is maybe a misunderstanding with the term racism versus prejudice or a racial bias, which I think racial bias and prejudice is more in the same category.
Yeah.
Versus racism is an action based off of those prejudices or biases.
Yeah.
And it can dip into like discrimination, which is an action.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Well, following up on that, we say, okay, then in this concept of racism, participating, acting on it, an action that might not look like an action that is still yet racist behavior is silence.
Inaction.
Yeah. So they're saying that racism manifests itself also in silence. And this is kind of now where white privilege is starting to appear. This inaction, the sense of it doesn't bother me, then we don't have a problem here, right? But the thing with or some examples would be flesh-colored Band-Aids. When we say flesh-colored Band-Aids, what color flesh are you talking about?
Right.
Right? Or when you have hair products, you'll have the hair product aisle and then ethnic hair product aisles, which is much smaller and out of the way. This is another example. Or how people are portrayed in the media. White people are glamorized versus black people might be as violent figures. So these are all examples of this white privilege. And I think it creates discomfort with people who hear the term white privilege. One, because in general, I think white people don't often look at themselves and define themselves as, I'm white, right? But all the time you will hear, oh, who was that guy you're talking about? Oh, I'm talking about the black guy.
Yeah.
Right away. This is already just a term that's labeled. But white people don't listen to themselves as, oh, I'm the white person in here. I'm the white person here. Hey, guys, I'm the white person. So there can be some kind of discomfort to white people to being defined by their race,
Right.
for one. And then the other thing with the word privilege, because people insinuate privilege with having more or a
Right.
better life. But we know that there are white people who also struggle, people who are on the bottom rung,
Right.
rural classes who might be feeling like, well, I'm not privileged. So why are you saying I have white privilege? So I think this is why there can be some kind of misunderstanding or pushback to hearing the term white privilege.
Right, which is very important for us to define semantically what we mean by white privilege, because in and of itself on the surface, it could get easily confused. But there are nuances to that word that we need to discuss. And I think once people understand the nuances of it, then I think less people can argue against the actual term
Sure.
and the existence of this privilege.
Yes. Yeah. So kind of to wrap it up, all of those things we just mentioned, but as you said, it's partly built into the system or the society or structure that you, as a white person, were born into and given just simply because you were born into that system.
Right.
All right. So this is loosely our definition of white privilege, and clearly you can go more and more into that. But we're going to leave it there for now. But I do highly recommend people do their own research and study on this and ask your own questions. But now we're going to ask it, is white privilege the same in Korea as it is in other multinational countries?
Oh.
Because the thing is, it's different. Multinational countries, like the US is a perfect example. There's people from all over the world living together, and you should be used to that by now, right? Oh, my neighbor's Indian, this neighbor's Jewish. Okay, we all live together in the same space. But Korea looks a little bit different. It's more homogenous,
Right.
and people are not encountering those who look vastly different from themselves on a daily basis.
Right. Yeah. So is it the same in Korea? than other multinational countries.
Is it?
Let's find out. So in March of 2020, just last year, the
Yeah.
Korean Herald, which is a journalistic company here based in Korea, they did a survey, and 68.3% said that they experienced some sort of racial
This
discrimination.
is a survey among foreign nationals.
Foreign nationals living in Korea. And so the 68.3% experienced racial discrimination, and 62.3% of people said it's because of their Korean language skill, or I guess maybe lack of
yeah.
more so. Because they were not Korean, made up about 59.7%, which is a big one. And just simply because of their race, 44.7%
Yeah.
of people claimed that.
That's huge.
That's-
I mean, those are really high numbers.
Yeah.
And interesting how people in Korea can pinpoint specifically why. Because I feel like maybe in the U.S. people are more. It can be hiding under the surface a little bit. Nobody wants to outright say it's because you're not Korean. We are treating you this way.
Right.
But in Korea, I feel like it's a bit more apparent.
Yeah.
Oh, they're 외국인. They're not Korean. So we don't treat 외국ins here.
Right.
Right? This is actually coming out in society in a more obvious manner.
Sure.
I feel like. So this is why it's interesting. You could pinpoint it down directly.
Right.
Why this is happening.
Yeah, and I can, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about it in a bit, but I could totally relate to, I guess, some of these reasons. You know, the Korean language skill, and also because I'm not fully Korean. You know, so yes, being half Korean does give me a little bit of a leg up, but at the end of the day, generally speaking, within the system that is set up here in Korea, I'm still not Korean. Which is a term
Right.
that we use when we talk to each other.
Isn't that
Korean,
interesting?
Korean.
Yeah, we have to emphasize that. And
Yeah.
it means something. And people know that. Oh, are you Korean or Korean? Right? Like, oh, well, no, I'm not Korean. You
Right.
see what I mean?
Yeah. So I can totally relate to the participants of this survey.
So let's talk a little bit more about the current atmosphere in Korea. So we already mentioned this survey, but we also know Korea has a somewhat supremacist attitude towards immigrants. Migrants coming into Korea, particularly migrants from countries that is, economically speaking, poorer than Korea. So, for example, Korea will look down on immigrants from Southeast Asia who are coming here and taking menial labor work. They will just automatically look down on you. And even if, say, your family's super rich in Vietnam and you came to Korea because you want to study, it doesn't matter. Still, again, we're using a lot of blanket statements here because the thing is, we don't have a lot of hard facts. Still, in general, Korean society will look down on you and be like, oh, well, she's a Vietnamese girl coming here to Korea trying to get money. They don't know that maybe you're actually really rich and you're opening a
Right.
business here, right?
Right.
So this does exist, I would say, in Korea at this point. So what about anti-discrimination bills? Do they exist in Korea? Do you know if they do?
Well, the last I've heard was there wasn't any hard, fast laws. And so as far as bills, I would assume there are probably bills in existence, but I don't know if they've been passed or seriously looked into being passed into legislation.
Yes,
Yeah.
this is true.
I mean, because I know we've talked about it in the past.
You want to know why? Because I keep getting those text messages. It finally put the pieces together. Because I kept getting these text messages from a Christian organization in Korea. And they kept saying, we, the youth of this so-and-so Christian organization, is against the anti-discrimination bill. Come to our rally to figure out why. Read this newsletter to learn more. And I was like, wait a minute, you're a Christian organization and you're still so anti-discrimination law. I found that to be a bit at odds with what the Christian religion originally should be teaching. But the more I looked into it, I realized it's because that the anti-discrimination laws here in Korea are trying to include the LGBTQ community.
Right.
And a lot of Christian groups here in Korea are against that. And so because these anti-discrimination laws, yes, they're there, but they're very thin. They are not really held up strongly. And then so they're trying to pass more. Another one was proposed just 2020. And it's still been failed. It hasn't yet passed. And the
Wow.
reason being is because it's blanketing all things, gender, race, orientation. And Korea is still very, let's say, it's very contentious to talk about LGBTQ rights here.
Yeah.
So the anti-discrimination bill has not yet strongly been passed and upheld here. So that's another thing to consider for when we're talking about racism that happens here in Korea. And then, of course, now in Korea, we're having a lot of more mixed kids being born. This is something that's going to happen and be more prevalent, especially as this current generation is getting older.
Right.
And we got to come face to face with that.
Right. And Korea can't be like, as there are more multinational families or multiracial, multi-ethnic families, they can't be like, okay, we're not going to deal with this. We're going to keep doing things as we normally do it because they have to face the reality of what's really happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Korea is going to have to really deal with this issue, and I think right now I want to say this season or this period of time is the beginning of Korea really having to deal with the reality that Korea isn't going to remain such a strong homogenous nation anymore. That what it means to be Korean might need to be shifted in the minds of people. Yeah, so Korea is, I think, facing that right now.
Maybe we should dive historically into why that has actually been Korea's strong point. Because Korea, we're always saying, Korea's very homogenous.
Yeah.
They try to stay between themselves, and it's worked up to now. And there's a reason for that. And I think it's important that we should lay that historical context first.
Sure, right. Because as I say with any individual, there's always a reason why they behave the way they behave, or there's always a reason why they have a certain mindset, good or bad. And I think the same thing can be said of a nation or a country that has a history. There's always a reason why nations and the people represented in that nation feels the way they do or views life the way they do.
Right.
So this is where we can take somewhat of an empathetical approach as well to try to see and understand from the perspective of, say, Korea or anyone that we're talking about. Not to say that we agree, but at least we can come from a place of understanding, and that's how we deal with these issues.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
So let's, I tried to, I was reading through all of these articles, and some of them were pretty heavy, but I was just trying to get a general timeline of Korea's interaction with Western countries.
Yeah.
And this, let me just give you a quick brief overview, which will help us to understand more now Korea's relationship with the concept of white power.
Yeah.
Okay? So there's this phrase in Korea called 고래 싸움에 새우 등 터진다. And that means when whales fight, the shrimp's back is broken, which sounds a little silly in English. But basically it's saying that when these two big individuals have a fight, who is the one who suffers? The small person. And this has been Korea historically. Korea is surrounded by these big international powers. We've got China over here, then the US getting involved, and then Russia and Japan, all of this happening. And Korea was the small country whose back was broken over their fights. So this is a phrase used to describe that, and I think it explains pretty well what went on. So China, as Korea's neighbor, was very technologically advanced, the society for thousands of years in East Asia they were dominating. And they had a lot of influence on Korea, all the way up until the modern times. And Korea has always been the focus of interest between China and Japan and Russia, and then, of course, the United States as time went on. And then there were invasions by the Japanese that was happening, and Korea was being attacked by the Mongols. There was just so much going on.
Right.
So Korea enforced a policy of very strict limited contact with other countries. This is why Korea was known as the Hermit Kingdom for hundreds of years, because they closed the borders. No one in, no one out, because we have suffered so much because of these outside influences, right? We had the Japanese colonial period where Korea was oppressed very much by Japan at that time. And then it was during the latter half of the 19th century when the Chinese Empire was declining. This is when the Western powers were getting very interested in East Asia. Oh, Korea, what's all that? And Britain, France, the US, they tried to open up Korea to trade and diplomacy starting in about the 1860s, and Korea always resisted. No, we don't want that. Then Christianity was starting to spread, first through China, coming to Korea. And we can see the early American Protestant missionaries who came to Korea. Who were those people? Typically, youth from American middle-class homes. Let's translate that. White people.
Yeah.
Right? I can't imagine any middle-class young Black Christians from America coming to Korea.
Definitely not.
So this would have been Korea's, I guess, introduction to this Christian white American society. And we talked about this in our Christmas episode, actually, because we were talking about how those missionaries brought a lot of the Christmas culture and traditions.
Right.
But at that time, American missionaries, they were middle class, comfortable. Yeah, they meant well, I suppose. But they basically created little American colonies in Korea. They were safe, they were comfortable, they were white. And so they were showing Korea, this is the spirit of Christ. This is what it means. And it also introduced the spirit of commercialism. So this, again, is another introduction to quote-unquote American culture. So this is kind of the brief history. And then let's talk about, very quickly, the war. When the war happened, the American forces entered Korea. This is the fact that really surprised me when I was reading, and I never, ever considered this. There was no reason prior for Koreans to naturally have a dislike for Black people, let's say.
Right.
Because there wasn't much interaction going on.
Sure.
But who did they greatly interact with? American GIs. And at the time when the American forces entered Korea, in America, they had just stopped segregating between Black and white soldiers.
Right.
It was very recent. So naturally, those behaviors that they would see between the soldiers, the American GIs, that's what Koreans would learn on how white people treated Black people.
Right.
I never considered that.
That makes total sense because again, even though desegregation happened around that time, as we all know, even up to today, there are still remnants and baggages of that.
Yeah.
So just imagine being in that period of time in the 50s and even 60s as the U.S. military really planted their roots here in South Korea, just getting this sort of narrative from the white soldiers about Black people.
Superiority and inferiority.
Yeah,
right?
making fun of Black people, things like that. And you could see, I could imagine that the Koreans are looking at these white soldiers as, oh, they're more powerful. They know what they're talking about because they put themselves in a position of power. So naturally, the Korean people are like, okay, so I guess these guys are the ones that are either in charge or they know what they're talking about. They're the ones that are leading, and then the leaders of the military, all white.
Yeah.
Yeah,
entirely. And Korea's society is already set up in the sense of status and hierarchy.
Yeah.
And so now when we have these outside forces coming in and creating a new sense of hierarchy, Korea would, I think it made a lot of sense to naturally fall into this concept. Oh, these people are on top, these people are on bottom. Because Korea was also trying to fit themselves as well into where's our status and our hierarchy. And on top of that, we had the perceived third world, quote unquote, countries. They're the ones who are dark skinned. They're the ones who aren't as wealthy as we are. And then always this idea that if you had pale skin, it meant you were richer because you didn't have to work outside. So I think all of these in combination, plus the lack of interaction with darker skinned people from other countries in Korea, and plus the media perceptions placed on them, was all brought in by Western forces. It's no wonder that today still there exists this concept of white is better, Black is worse in Korea.
Right. And this is where we can have or take that empathetic approach in seeing from the eyes of Korean people. Just imagine experiencing everything that they've experienced over, the several hundreds of years. We can easily go back to history and just recount the events that has happened. And we can easily say, yes, this country invaded during this time, and then there was the Japanese colonization of this time. But just imagine the emotional toll that actually the people had to live through during that time. And then you couple that into last century with more, the capitalism and the commercialism and all of the Western ideals starting to come in.
Yeah.
And you put all of that together, And not only that, but like if you think about it, especially during that time around the Korean War, Korea looked at the U.S. military highly. They as top allies, and really they were a huge part in them breaking away from the colonization, and from the war. So, there was a certain respect that they had for the military, at least at the time. And so all of that plays a part into developing their paradigm and how they look at, race and culture.
Yeah, that is so well said. I totally agree with you. I was trying to find, were there extensive research held about all of this? Because these are things, again, extrapolating from what I've read, these articles and resources I found, but I couldn't find anything specifically saying this is what people think in Korea based on this research, etc. But I did find one article that I thought was very revealing in many aspects. And this was called Cross-Racial Cultural Dating Preferences Amongst Chinese, Japanese, and Korean International Students in an American University. So these are the international students coming to the States to study there. And basically, they were asking them, which kind of person would you consider as a most desirable partner and why? And obviously, a lot of these things that we just talked about now, they did affect these students and in their choices for a romantic partner. But essentially, it came to the conclusion that they would consider white people having the highest standing and possessing the largest cultural capital. And then those who could somehow win that position of being quote unquote white were the ones who could get good education, the ones who had better jobs. If you had lighter skin color, then you were kind of honorary white, for example. And so a lot of these international students, they adopted these negative stereotypes that they saw in their American counterparts, in the American media, because they oftentimes lacked a deep understanding of slavery, historical, institutional racism that's still happening today. And it seems that many of these students, when asked, they would think that, why, for example, in the States, a lot of African Americans, why did they suffer from slavery and poverty today? And a lot of them would think it's personal incompetence and just misfortune.
Yeah.
Because there's a lack of education and they're being influenced by what they're hearing and seeing around them. So that white privilege, in a way, stems just directly from Western societies and just this power disbalance that has happened historically with Korea and bigger nations around them. So let's fast forward a little bit to some more modern times. And as Korea is becoming more multicultural, as we're seeing kids who are being bilingual now, who are growing up in households with mixed cultures, we got to talk about this.
Yeah.
We got to talk about white privilege even here in Korea and the systematic racism that I believe has somehow been fostered on Korean soil due to outside influences. And so there's an article that came out in 2015 from these researchers, and they were asking this question about how do we discuss race in a bilingual classroom, which is a very excellent question to ask, because that's the reality we are going to face here in Korea, especially now that we're having mixed kids growing up. So they came to the conclusion that children start to understand racial differences at a very early age. They, even as young as 3 or as 4, are using racial and ethnic concepts as important, integrative, and symbolically creative tools in the daily construction of their social lives. So basically saying that children, even that young, are understanding there's differences, racial differences, and they're using those to distinguish themselves from each other, from other groups, okay? So the way that these researchers were trying to study this is they used literature, multicultural literature, and they would show these students, or they would read these kids books with the characters looking different from the kids in the classroom. And when they first started that, they had one book that had a girl who was black on the front, a kid on the front. And the kids resisted reading this book. So we don't want to read that book. And when they were asking them why and trying to figure out, okay, why don't you want to, read more about this girl? A lot of times the kids would feel frustrated. They would feel like this book isn't their experience and their culture. They don't want to read that. But they had more resistance to black characters because it was kind of understood in the broader context of white supremacy. So,
Right.
oh, well, we don't want to read about that girl because she's not pretty, is what one of the kids would say. Or we don't want to read about her because she's so different. She's not like us. And so even at that very young age, students were understanding there's a difference between us. And so in the classroom, they noticed that students whose language was the minority, or they didn't speak the same language as everyone else, they were the ones who were experiencing racism on a daily basis. So even in Korea, where maybe the kids will not be so different as white and black, maybe they're mixed. They're still part Korean because their language might be different. Maybe they don't speak Korean fluently here. We know this is still going to be an issue. And how are we going to address that?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So another thing just to tag on to that is African Americans comprise an extremely small percentage of the Korean population. And the only tools for Koreans to learn about African Americans, and this also includes students, is the mass media.
Yeah.
Korean high school students ranked black people highest in categories like laziness and aggression, and lowest in categories like diligence and hygiene.
Yeah.
And you have to wonder, where do they get this sort of idea from?
Right.
And a big part of it, again, it's just, I mean, there's not one single source, but it's just sort of just this tone that they pick up because kids, whether they be very young, 3 or 4, preschool age, or even high schoolers, they pick this up from their surroundings, whether they hear stuff from their parents or they're watching the media. They get these negative stereotypes reinforced. Yeah, through the music they listen to. And here's the thing. When I first moved to Korea 3 years ago, I came as a teacher.
Yeah.
And so I primarily taught English to elementary school and middle school students. And the cool thing was because I worked in a different non-traditional type of school where we would host English training camps for students in different schools in the city, we would get a turnover every week of different students. So I was able to really experience how Korean students, really saw culture from like, I didn't have the same set of students basically throughout the whole year. I just had different students. And I quickly found out what everything we've been talking about is totally accurate, because a lot of these students did have these certain stereotypes about black people specifically, because I was the black and Korean teacher, right? And no one knew that I was actually half Korean because I'd never revealed that until the last day of camp, where we would have like this ask me anything like session with the teachers.
Yeah.
So no one knew that I was half Korean. So people would say, they would just say, oh, black people are really good at basketball or sports, or they're very good at rapping. That's another thing, because these kids are into hip hop. And the thing is, I mean, those don't sound like negative stereotypes, but the thing is, you can't group all of black people into these categories, because I think what these kids, how they look at black people is these are the most desirable attributes that they have, that they're talented in sports and they can rap. But they never say, oh, black people are smart or inventors or innovative or anything like that.
Yeah.
So those are the things that I was able to experience firsthand. And also, all of them thought I looked like Black Panther. Well, actually, not Black Panther, but who was the bad character with the braids?
What?
Michael B. Jordan
They
played?
thought you looked like him?
Yeah.
No.
So it's because my hair.
Oh, your hair. Oh, okay, I can see that. Yeah.
Which, so that, again, I was just like, y'all have not seen a lot of black people.
That's funny.
So, I mean, it's a good compliment. I'll take that. But again, I was able to see just how these Korean kids had a certain mindset and attitude towards black people, in which many times they're not negative per se, but there is an undertone of negativity there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Korea's history is just so different than other countries when it comes to this struggle with discrimination and racism in a very close interaction with each other. Because Korea, it's been those nations and then us. While in the US or in other Western nations, it's like, you're still one of us, but you're also not one of us. So it's a different type of struggle that exists in Korea. And again, I wouldn't necessarily say it's outright dislike. I feel like it's more somehow learned or it's impressions
Yeah.
that come, right, from other outside influences. Something to follow up on that article that I was talking about for the kids. This is the good news. That the teacher throughout the year was doing this research with her students, and it's all bilingual. So when you read the article, it's in Korean and English mixed. And you can see how the children's concept changes throughout her research. At first, it's very, no, we don't want to, no, no, no. And they separate between themselves and other students. Oh, I am white and Korean. You are black and Korean. And there's a separation that's happening at first. And it becomes very apparent when they're reading these books. And then as the research goes on and the teacher talks about it and asks questions, you can see how the children, it's not innate, it's learned. And sometimes they don't even know where they're learning this negative ideas about other people and other races. But when it's addressed, corrected, then we move on. And it showed how the children by the end were not even noticing if the character on the book looked different from them.
Right.
And I think this is a very valuable thing we should recognize, especially when we're having more mixed kids growing up in Korea, because this is something we can help to stop as the next generation grows.
Right. So there's a lot of takeaways with that research being done in that, because the kids they changed quickly, once the issue was brought to the forefront and addressed. So one of the takeaways from that I see is you have to bring the issue to the forefront. You have to address the issue and really make a dialogue or discussion about it so that you can move on from it and progress from it. Instead of what we've been doing, at least in the States, and in many ways, what I see has been done here is we just pretend like it doesn't exist, or we say, oh, I'm not like that, but, I don't have that issue, so I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to address it. I think that we need to just bring it up and then talk about it.
Yeah.
And then from there, I think the more that we're willing to be honest with it and to confront this reality and the fact that we might be guilty, the sooner it is we can deal with it and move on from it. I think that's one of the reasons why we haven't been able to move past this issue, at least in the States, is because we haven't really, everyone as a whole hasn't dealt with the issue and wrestled with it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I foresee in Korea, not to be a doomsayer, but I foresee that it could have this same terrible impact on Korea because we haven't really talked about this in the open. Nobody's really direct about multiculturalism and how to fight racism and white supremacist attitudes here. More than white supremacy, I would say white privilege attitudes here. And that's because it hasn't affected everyone. Nobody's really, it's not like come across them at most points. It's usually people who have mixed kids, who are mixed themselves, are the ones thinking about this because it's their daily life that they're dealing with all the time. Right. But Korea now is becoming more heterogeneous as a society. And if we don't talk about it now, then we're going to be behind the times again. And maybe we're going to have so many people suffering from these racist behaviors or biases because we didn't address it now.
Right.
We are fortunate, I believe, as Korea to witness other countries and see what we can learn, how to avoid certain pitfalls or some things that have been done right. And we can get ahead of the game here. And this is partly why we do the Halfie Project.
Oh, yeah. I think this is huge because we're bringing up these issues. And the thing is, as we've learned in some ways, me and you, the hard way, is a lot of people in Korea, not everybody for sure, but there's a good percentage, I would say, of people, they're not ready to really deal with this issue. They're not ready to hear it. They don't want to have anything to do with it.
It's hard to address it in yourself.
Yeah, and I mean, that really goes for anyone. In the States, it's the same thing. That's why we have the problem now. But with what we do with the Halfie Project and with just who we are and just us constantly talking about it, I think we are in some part contributing at least to the progression of going towards, I don't want to say a non-racist or non-discriminatory type of society, but at least we're chipping away. You know?
I hope so.
It's like we're digging for the gold, for the diamond. I don't know where you dig for
Yeah.
what, but you're digging for
Great
something.
metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just like we're chipping away little by little.
Yeah.
And there's still a lot to go, a lot of work to do, but we just have to address it. We have to, and I think the sooner we're ready to deal with it, the sooner we can change. It sounds so simple, easier said than done, but yeah, I mean, I have so much to say about it, and perhaps we can talk about this a little bit more in future episodes. But yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I think it's just a matter of presenting this tough issue and being willing to learn and admit if we're not a victim of these biases, but we're a part of the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very heavy topic, and a lot of it comes down to how you're communicating it. Because I again, if we're going to talk about the anti-discrimination laws in Korea, why does it get so bogged down? It's because people are forgetting we're trying to protect people. We're trying to protect these groups of people who have no protection. But we can't look at that. We can't accept it because we disagree with this one section. We don't like gay people, so none of you get protection. We're forgetting here what's the real purpose. We're trying to move past our biases that have been damaging and hurting other people. But I feel like because in the communication, things get mixed up, people's emotions get hot, then nothing's happening. And so this is why when we're talking about these kind of topics, it's important to keep a cool head and to understand the context. And that's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah.
Well, white privilege in Korea, maybe just to give some more concrete examples. What would that might look like in Korea? And some examples that I was thinking about, perfect speaking, is plastic surgery.
Yeah.
In Korea, because if you're here in Korea, you're going to see plastered all over the walls advertisements for clinics, and they show these beautiful pale-skinned girls with big eyes and little pert noses. They like to get those rhinoplasty, and it's almost this Eurasian look,
Yeah.
quote unquote ideal beauty.
Yeah, basically like you. Like
You're so flattering.
So no, like, yeah, the thing is, even though there is a distinct look that Koreans have or that is marketed as the standard of beauty, there are a lot of influences from the West that you can see. And one of the most common plastic surgery procedures is what? It's the double eyelid surgery.
Yeah, the double eyelid.
Right. And this, if you don't know what that is, it's basically where, because a lot of Asians, including Koreans, have mono eyelids, which gives them the Asian looking eyes.
Yeah.
And I don't know where it started, but at some point, it wasn't really a desirable thing. A lot of Korean people feel like, well, if I had a fold, or like double eyelids as they call it, I can look more beautiful. I could look even more Western. I've heard a lot of Korean people say they wanted to look more Western. And I would venture to say that by Western, they mean white. You know what I mean? So that's one of the most common procedures. And even high schoolers or post-high school college age, that's sort of a common time to get it.
It's a high school gift, oftentimes,
a graduation
from the parents.
gift, right?
Yeah, because the thing is, if you think more and more about specifically just the eyelid, it's because there's a sort of demonization of the monolid. Oh, you look Asian, right? So there's one, a demonization, putting that down, to the glamorization of the double eyelid, the white woman with the big eyes and the eyelashes. So they're saying, oh, the world media is saying, this is the pretty look, this is pretty girls. On YouTube, no, this is no, shaming for YouTubers, but who's very prominent, who has always been very prominent? White YouTuber girls who are doing their eye makeup, and so they look very pretty and they get so much attention. No wonder people are watching that. Korean girls, oh, I want to look like that. But she has the double eyelid. I can't do my makeup because I don't have the double eyelid.
Yeah.
So this is another thing that kind of propels this concept that having the double eyelid is going to make you prettier, going to make you more successful. Korea is very much about the status and the hierarchy. And this just seems to be another kind of rippling effect that has reached to Korean society. Double eyelid.
Right. And I mean, there are tons of other procedures, of course, like, they want the smaller nose because that's more beautiful. And
More like a little pointed nose. People like the ridge. They like the
Yeah.
pointed nose here.
right,
That's very
right.
common.
And we can go on and on about the plastic surgery, but I
Yeah.
think you guys get the point. I guess another example that I'm not super familiar with, I'm not gonna lie, but apparently a lot of Thai and Filipinos are obsessed with the Korean look.
So I would say it's because of this. And again, understand that a lot of we're doing for this episode is trying to make educated hypotheses.
Sure.
Okay, speculations. But Korea has emerged among Asian markets as very successful, beautiful K-pop idols, this concept of, this is the beautiful look. But we know that Korea is greatly influenced by the Western look. Korea has emerged as a stronger nation economically speaking, and now they are global players. So compare that some other East Asian countries who have not yet reached economically that standard. And so looking up to your neighbors, Korea, wow, those women are so beautiful. And then now plastic surgery is so prevalent. It's cheaper than going to the West to get plastic surgery there, but you can still achieve this certain Western beauty look. So in Thailand, in the Philippines especially, the Korean look is very, very popular. A lot of this is due to dramas and K-pop.
Right.
Yeah. Isn't it weird? It's like a waterfall. Like here's America
Right.
waterfalling
And
into Korea, who's
and then-
waterfalling.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, another thing that you'll see, especially here in Korea and other Asian countries as well, are whitening products.
Yeah.
And so this is where these are products that are designed to make your skin look whiter in one way or another. So not necessarily, it's not like skin bleaching or anything
Some
like that.
products have been.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've heard. Yeah, I think the ones that I'm more familiar with are the ones like the over the counter like whitening
Yeah.
creams or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
I even like a 4-in-1 little moisturizer thing that I even used for my first 2 years here that you were hating on because I like to do all my steps in one go. Even on the bottle it says it's a whitening type of
Oh, interesting.
solution, which I didn't use it for that.
Yeah.
Obviously, yeah. I mean, I liked it and it didn't whiten my skin. I didn't expect it to. But that is something that is quite common.
Yeah.
And that's because let's just call it what it is. Whiter is beautiful. Generally speaking, that's what's marketed here in Korea. Now, I think a lot of people who, let's just say they're into K-pop or Korean culture from the West, they see Korea, rarely are you going to see someone who is darker skin in Korea as a celebrity.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people that are, darker
Yeah.
toned. And so you're never going to see that in the media.
Yeah.
At least in the forefront.
It's not common for sure. Or they play specific types of characters.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's another thing that is an example.
Another thing is things that are more subtle. For example, if you're considered non-Korean, you're expected automatically to speak English. This has a lot to do with the power play. Now, English is the common tongue when we think worldwide. So if people in Korea see you and they know you're not Korean, doesn't matter where you're from. You could be from France, you could be from Germany, but you're not Korean, therefore you speak English.
Right.
That's just the expectation. But you might not. But it's kind of this subtle separation and just assumptions that are being made. And especially if you're white, right away it's, well, you speak English.
Right.
Obviously. Why? Because white people are educated. White people are, richer. They probably travel. They're probably from the States. This is an assumption that is made.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I even thought about one of the more popular younger models, Black and Korean model, Han Hyun-min. Same thing happens with him, actually. He doesn't have the traditional Korean look,
No.
even though he's half Korean. And he's not American. His dad is not from an English-speaking country. I forget which
Right.
African
I
country
think
he's
Nigeria.
from. Sure. But he deals with that all the time. People trying to speak English to him, and he's like, I don't understand English.
Yeah.
He's fluent in Korean because he grew up in Korea. So that's another example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These
just expecting.
assumptions.
Right.
And of course, in what's seen in the media, right? Because Korea, obviously, even we know media is influenced once again by powerful countries, etc., Hollywood, right? And so what is Hollywood portraying? And this is what comes into Korea as well.
Right.
We could always speculate, well, what if Korea didn't have these influences from the US? Would Korea still have these same racist mindsets? Would we still have this white privilege concept? I'm not entirely sure, if it would be to the same effect. There did still exist this divide, between people with fair skin because they didn't work in the sun versus people with darker skin, quote unquote, farmers or rural workers, right? So I think that still did exist, but I don't know if it would be to the same extent, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And we hope to see more positive representations happening in the media because we know there's a new generation growing up in Korea. And we would love for them to have role models in media, seeing somebody who looks like them, who's being a prominent person in society and not just pigeonholed into a certain expectation of what they're supposed to be like. So that is something that we strive to see happening here, and we'll keep working towards that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Hopefully we could be a part of that,
Yeah,
the representation.
You should be in the next drama, though. That's
Man,
cute.
I'm down.
Kim Sedi.
Yeah, I'll be down.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens.
We'll see.
You and I know what's going down soon.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
Yeah.
We won't give it away, guys, but he
No.
might be in a drama.
We'll see.
We'll see. Keep your fingers crossed. All right, well, that's all I have here. It's a very heavy topic, and if you want to learn more about that, I do recommend doing your own research, doing your own study, and as always, you can get in contact with us if you've got questions or you've got your own stories, and I imagine your experiences will all be very different, especially if you were growing up in Korea in a different generation than us. So we want to hear from you, and that being said, it's time for listener mail. So we love getting listener mail from you guys, and we had this email come in. This is pertaining to our Mongolian Blue Spot episode that came out some time ago. So here it goes. Hi guys, just listened to your topic or your podcast on the topic above, and I loved it. I was so happy to find people talking about this subject. There's so much written on this topic, but I can't always find it together in one place. This is specifically has different meanings for different cultures, and I know you guys put so much time and energy and research into all of this. Thank you for recognizing that. And anyway, so she says her daughter is 1 year old, and she was born with a Mongolian blue spot. And at first, the doctors said it was a malignant mole, right? Or a blue nervous. I'm not sure what she means by that, but apparently something that didn't make her feel too good. And they said, it can't be a Mongolian spot because for her baby, this is just one big giant spot. And they were really scared. It really scared her when they said this to her at the hospital. And they didn't even mention the Mongolian spot. Oh, so I guess, yeah, it doesn't seem to be something very commonly recognized, perhaps, or people don't know exactly what it is all the time. So they said, if you want to validate it, go see a dermatologist. So she saw a skin specialist, and she was Asian. She seemed very nice, and she looked at her baby's skin with a magnifying glass and said, oh yeah, this is the Mongolian spot, or congenital dermal melanocytosis. You remember we had trouble saying that? Yeah. Right. So a more scientific term for it. I was relieved when I heard this because the baby's father had told me not to believe the doctor as well, and my families and friends had said the same thing. So hearing this news from a specialist on skin just made me feel so much better, knowing my baby is fine. So she's from the Dominican Republic. Baby's father is Jamaican, and she didn't know anything about this skin condition until she saw it on her baby. So I want to thank you so much for talking about this topic, and now I'm your #1 fan. Woohoo! Woo! God bless you for all you do. Hope you guys continue making a difference on people's lives. Sincerely, Anna. Thank you so much for that message.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That is so cool.
I would have never imagined that episode would be impactful to so many people.
Apparently, a lot of people wrote in saying when their baby was born, they had no idea what this was. They heard the episode and like, oh my gosh, I didn't need to freak out at that time.
Right.
Yeah. Apparently quite more common than I expected.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. We also want to read another listener mail from another fellow Halfie by the name of Thomas. Mm-hmm. And he says, I want to say that I love that there is something like the Halfie Project. Where was this 20 years ago?
Yeah, where was it?
I mean, I have the same question too. Mm-hmm. I'm half Korean and I grew up in Bossier City, Louisiana in the mid-90s. I was the only person of Korean heritage back then for the longest time. In high school, there were some Koreans, but they were quote unquote full Korean. And so they they weren't, I guess their experience wasn't the same that I had growing up. I grew up in both an American and Korean household. I was fortunate enough to grow up with my mother and her family in Louisiana. Along with them in the small Korean community, and I do mean small, from the local Korean Presbyterian church, I'm sure we can all relate to that.
Yeah.
I would say that I was more immersed in Korean culture than most would in similar circumstances to my own. My aunt and uncle do not speak English very well, and though my mother is fluent in English and hardly has an accent, I know she is more comfortable expressing herself in Korean. Can totally relate to you, Thomas. Growing up, I had difficulty being able to speak to my mother, uncle, and aunt about their past and how they grew up because of the language barrier.
This is very common.
Yes, yeah, totally. So in a way, I don't really know them as most would know about their parents and family lineage. I feel the opportunity of a deeper connection is or can be lost.
Yeah.
Thomas continues to write, my Korean is a work in progress. Because of growing up with my mother's family, I have an ear, so to speak, for Korean. When I would come home from college during the holidays, I would be able to recall more and speak with them in a very basic way. But to have deep conversations about how they feel about things still evades me. And now, as they get older, I feel it is a race against time for me trying to learn Korean so I can hopefully really have a conversation with them before they pass away. On a side note, I realized that because of my mother's family and the Korean community I grew up with, the Korean I know is not the same as the Korean that is spoken in Korea today. As in this small Korean enclave of Korean women, mostly, who came to the US in the late 70s and 80s, speak a shade of Korean from the 70s and 80s, which is what I know to be Korean. I just always thought that was interesting. Thank you so much for letting me share a bit of my story. I very much appreciate the work that you do, Thomas.
That is a very, very astute observation.
Listen, I felt like I wrote this letter because that is totally 100% my experience. And I think every single point that you brought up, Thomas, is how I felt growing up in the 90s, being a 90s kid, with the small Korean community in my location. I sort of had that same feeling of wanting to know my family's roots and stories, at least on the Korean side, but there was that language barrier. So I could totally relate to that. And fortunately, I was able to, in the last couple of years, really sit down with my mom and wrote out my questions in Korean so that she would be able to answer fully in Korean her experiences growing up and why she came to the States. And luckily, I was able to capture that. But I totally get it. My mom's getting older too. So Thomas, thank you for writing that in.
Yeah, I think that encapsulates a lot of feelings that half Koreans who grew up in the States will experience very strongly, especially if you don't have the Korean tongue to a level of fluency where you can connect on very difficult topics. And talking about your family and their history and past, it's difficult talking to your family as is, especially when you're talking about the past or long hurts or whatever, because it can feel awkward. But especially when you have these additional barriers like language or culture, misunderstandings, it can be exceptionally difficult. And so I feel a lot of half Koreans feel the same way, Thomas. And we just want to encourage you that you're not alone in that, in feeling that way. And also trying to learn Korean is not only going to make you feel more in touch with your Korean side and your Korean culture and background, but it's also going to open up doors of conversation between you and your family. And that's priceless. Yeah. So we wish you the best on that. And don't give up, because Korean is a difficult language. So keep it up. And for all of you Korean language learners out there, you guys will eventually reach that point. Language is just a matter of study and practice. So we believe in you. All right. Thanks for writing in those great emails. If you guys who are listening to this episode have anything you else would like to say, you can email us at thehalfieproject@gmail.com. If you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment below, subscribe to the channel. And you can, of course, listen to podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. That's it. We'll see you next time. We are the Halfie Project.